Please join me in prayer. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be acceptable to you, God, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Sheree, will you grab my water, please? Thank you. It's nice to have friends here. Today's gospel lesson begins with Jesus being approached by someone who wants him to order their brother to divide the family's inheritance with them. Jesus says he is not the judge over them, and instead of doing that, he tells them a story. A story about another man with great wealth. A story about a man who had chosen to hoard his wealth instead of choosing to share it, to divide it amongst his family or his friends or his community. A man who chooses to build bigger barns in order to have more space to hold his wealth. He tears down what he already has and builds new structures, bigger and better, in order to hoard more. Then he sits back and he says to himself and to his soul, "Soul, we have done well. Live, eat, drink, be merry." Suddenly, God comes to this man, calls him foolish, and tells him he is going to die, and then all that he has hoarded, whose will it be? Jesus then ends with a warning saying, "So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." So what does it all mean? What is Jesus' warning? What does the story say about life, about how we should live? What does it say about God, about the earth, about the cosmos? Y'all hear me okay? Okay, my mic's doing some weird things up here. When we listen to a story like this, we can hear it in different ways depending on what position in life we are in. Some of us hear this story and think, this story is telling us that wealth is bad, that money is bad. Others hear it and think, no, this story is telling us that hoarding wealth is bad, but it's okay to be wealthy. This is a story about all of these things. It's about wealth and what that means. It's about hoarding and the implications of that. It's about labor, about who benefits and who is harmed. It's about what goes on in our minds and in our hearts. And it's about God, how we see God, who God is, and who we are called to be in response to that. This lesson begins with hoarding, with a person getting more and more stuff, maybe even taking stuff so that others cannot get it, like that person with the toilet paper, and then building bigger and bigger containers. I think that was going to happen. Building bigger and bigger containers to hold it all in. Does that sound familiar? I'm sure many of us have been there. We buy more and more things, and eventually we need a bigger apartment or house. We work more and more hours, we make more money, and eventually we think we need a nicer and better car. We deserve it. We hoard and we hoard and we hold on to it all, keeping it for ourselves or for our families, but no one else can have it. 2 years ago, in the peak of the pandemic, when cleaning supplies were scarce and hand sanitizer and masks were nowhere to be found, I saw images like this one. People stockpiling supplies in their garage and storage sheds, and then selling them on Amazon for outrageous prices. A global pandemic is going on, and instead of trying to keep our neighbors safe, some people were making money off of other people's illness or lack of safety. And we all know that's nothing new. We live in a country that was built on that mentality, in a country that was built by people who were enslaved, an entire economy built by the labor of people who were captured, shipped across the ocean like cargo from the continent of Africa to the continent of North America. An economy that is still being built by the indentured labor of underpaid workers, both in our country and around the world, where the few profit and the many push and push and grind just to get by, living paycheck to paycheck, just one hospital bill away from being flat broke. Author Adrienne Marie Brown writes in her book, Pleasure Activism, "We live in a world which others imagined. Someone imagined a racialized economic system built on a foundation of indentured labor and slavery, exploitative production of dehumanized people to benefit those who labor less or not at all. In capitalism, the norm and assumption is that we must always be producing and growing in scale, so we either work ourselves to death, or if we are privileged, we work others to death or under risk of death, though these days we prefer that the exploitation stay out of sight behind bars or across borders." This is not God's vision, beloved people. This is not God's vision for God's world. Somehow, through sin, both institutional and individual, through capitalism and exploitation, our minds have been warped to believe we don't have enough. Our minds have been warped to believe that we are not doing enough. Our minds have been warped to believe that we are not enough. But these are lies. These are lies that keep us stressed out, that keep us striving to work more hours, to get more money, to buy more things, so that somehow, through these acts of working and gaining and buying, we too can be enough. But we already do enough. We already have enough. We already are enough. We know that we are enough because we are as God made us. We are deeply loved by God. We are so completely loved by God, and this love tells us that we are enough. And this love never, ever runs out. We know that the love of God is like a waterfall that has no end, that drenches us, and still there is even more love than that. We are already enough in our very creation. And because God is infinite, because God exists both within our linear time and far beyond our linear time, we know that there is always more of God. We can't even wrap our minds around the infinity of God. And when we think about that much vastness, we have to imagine that there is always more. That just as there is enough of God to go around, there is enough of all to go around. There's enough time, enough money, enough energy, enough wealth, enough food, but only if we don't hoard it or exploit it or destroy it. A couple of weeks ago, images from the James Webb Telescope were released. And I'm not even going to try to pretend like I know what this is a picture of. I was trying to study astrophysics before I came here, and I was telling my friend I just went down an astrophysics rabbit hole, but I will tell you what I understand when I look at this picture. This is a tiny snapshot of where we are in the universe. This image is universes within universes within universes. I heard astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson say that this is as if we took a grain of sand off of the beach and held it up to the sky. That is how much we are seeing here. Just think about that for a second. Let your mind be blown. And yet this is how big our God is. This is our God who is outside of and within and wraps around time. And this God holds us and tells us that we are loved and that we are enough. Commentator Arendira writes, being unbound by both space, time, and material, spiritual, means that the divine reorients our understanding of abundance, how we conceive of time and space, and how we are situated and move within all three, how we move within space, time, abundance. How can we allow this knowing that God is infinite, that God is beyond our conception of time and space, allow us to imagine new possibilities for the concept of wealth, to imagine new possibilities for how we use our time, how we use our money, for the ways we build our labor, our communities, to imagine new possibilities for our future. How can we allow this to examine our histories and write new stories that redeem our pasts? We start by knowing that we are enough, that we have enough. And from here, we move outward, sharing what we have with others, making sure our actions do not harm others, do not exploit the labor of others. Let's allow this parable to invite us into believing that we are enough, that I am enough, that you are enough, and that we have enough, and invite us into sharing what we have with others so that all may have enough. Enough resources, time, food, money, enough grace, forgiveness, and love. What would it look like if all knew they were enough and all had enough? How then might we begin to live richly towards God, as the parable states? Arendira goes on to write, how beautiful it would be to be there, able to love generously, abundantly, unconditionally, thanks to that deep, embodied sense of our own enoughness. How can we begin to love more generously out of our own enoughness? How can communities that have caused harm begin to repair the harm caused through striving, exploiting labor, and hoarding? We love generously by giving reparations to Black people who have continually been harmed by the ills of forced labor and enslavement. We who are still today suffering from wage gaps caused by institutional racism. We love generously by sharing our wealth with those who have less than we do, by walking away from lifestyles that exploit the many while few benefit. How beautiful would it be if we modeled a spirit of cooperation instead of competition, of thriving instead of striving, if we continually imagined new futures together? One way that some of us are imagining new futures together is through creating spaces of mutual aid. Mutual aid is the way that communities come together to care for one another through financial giving, through resource sharing, through listening, through walking alongside one another. I'm part of this mutual aid organization, which is called Koinonia, and it's specifically for BIPOC and queer clergy. It's a way we can support one another and walk alongside one another, but it's also a way that white and hetero people can contribute financially to support BIPOC and queer leaders as well. What if we allowed ourselves to live into the fullness of God's promise to care for the lilies and the fields and the birds of the air, and so surely, truly, to care for us as well, to always care for us as well, all of us? What if we allowed ourselves to be instruments of care for our siblings instead of forces of destruction, of consumption, of take, of getting more, of building bigger homes to hold all of our stuff? But instead, we looked for ways to give, to share, to empower, to build relationships instead of barns, to make sure we are all cared for, none are harmed, and all live in abundance. Amen.